The ignored warning. This happened when I was 18 years old, making the road trip from my hometown to my new school. I had all my stuff stuffed in the trunk and back seat of my cheap SUV. Not only was this my first long solo road trip, but it was also going to be the first time I would be away from my family for an extended time, so my nerves were reasonably high. Anyway, the directions I followed indicated that it was 600 miles in total, which I divided into 2 days of driving. I followed the route marked out by the maps and estimated that I would arrive at the hotel at 11 p.m., but with possible traffic, gas stops, and food, I knew that I would probably arrive much later. By 7 p.m., the sun had completely gone away, and so had most cars. Every once in a while, a car would pass by and watch its headlights slowly fade in front of me. But for most of the ride, I was alone. This actually made me feel very tired and bored. Around 10 p.m., I decided that I would stop at the next gas station before making the last leg of the trip. About 10 minutes later, I pulled off the road and into a gas station. It was so far away that it wasn't a village or anything like that. It was literally just a gas station with a few pumps and a small shop. I didn't see any other cars on the road or in the parking lot, not even lights from any nearby houses or buildings in the distance. I stopped right at a pump and went outside to start filling up my tank. And looking around, I almost got scared of a guy coming up to me. Compared to me, he was much older. Probably in his 50s if he had to guess, and he honestly looked like a bum. But regardless, being approached here wasn't something I expected, and his short smile didn't make me feel any more comfortable. "Do you need anything?" I said, hoping he wouldn't get any closer. The man stopped a few feet from my car and looked around, almost cautiously, before replying, "Take the exit back to the freeway." I looked at him confused, not sure if he was getting it right. He pointed behind me to the exit I came from and repeated, "Take the exit back to the freeway." After a second I said, "Okay," and the man left, but he was still really confused. The exit he came from and wanted me to take again was a one-way, so by his logic, he wanted me to drive against traffic and make a U-turn back onto the freeway. It just didn't make any sense. I looked down at the driveway which I was supposed to take, and there was no sign of any construction or anything blocking it. It just looked like an empty ramp back to the freeway. As I put the bomb back in and drove back to my car, I glanced at the man who was now sitting against the side of the convenience store. The more I thought about it, the crazier that man looked, just sitting there talking nonsense. I thought maybe it was some kind of trap or something. So I followed my gut and walked out of the parking lot toward the freeway entrance. As I sat up, I noticed that virtually all the streetlights were off. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a construction zone or something. I kept my eyes focused on the road directly in front of me, making sure to be cautious about anything. But as I made my way down the unlit road, I only saw a brief outline of a figure to my left before a pickup truck appeared out of nowhere and pulled up right in front of my car. All the doors opened and 4 men ran out of the van and approached my car holding weapons of all kinds. Metal bats, machetes, knives. They didn't even have anything covering their faces. They just had this emotionless look, like they didn't feel anything they were doing. I quickly started backing up as they got within just a few feet of my windows, and once I backed up far enough, I suddenly saw the outline of dozens of people coming out of the shadows on the side of the road. Some even tried to chase my car as I frantically backed up to get out of there as soon as possible. I turned around and accelerated. I called 911 once I felt safe, but for some reason I never got a call back, no update at all, almost as if they hadn't even checked. Ironically, it was the creepy old man at the gas station who tried to keep me from getting into that mess, or at least that's what I assumed he was doing. Anyway, I was incredibly lucky to get out of there alive, as I have no idea what that was or what they all planned to do with me. The strange car. While delivering a shipment to a company on the far west coast from the east coast, the cross-country route is one I've taken many times before, being a truck driver for nearly 20 years. It's always the same every time I make one of these trips. Same roads, same truck stops, and everything the same for these 20 years. Although nothing really crazy has ever happened to me, I've had some weird scenarios, but they've never come to anything. So when I was driving this route again, I had no worries on my mind. It was just another day at work. About 20 hours into the road, a storm began to approach and slow down my driving speed. It was already late, so by then I was already looking for the next truck stop to sleep in. As I was driving, a very sudden light appeared behind me. The road I was on was flat and straight, so I would have seen them coming in my mirror, but it was suddenly that they were right behind me. Maybe they had just turned on their lights or something, I didn't know that, but they quickly approached the back. I kept my eyes on them until they got so close that they were completely covered by the trailer. All I could see were their lights reflecting off the rear, but then their lights went out. I kept up my speed and kept looking in my mirrors, trying to see if they were still behind me, but I had no way of knowing. For someone to turn off their lights in the middle of a heavy storm was crazy, and following me so closely was equally crazy. Luckily, a sign indicated that a truck stop was only 5 miles away, so at least I knew I was close to getting away from whatever this was. I didn't want to jump to conclusions based on bizarre behavior alone, but as a truck driver, it's hard not to think about the possibility that it was an attempted robbery, especially when you're alone on the road at night. For the rest of the 5 miles, I saw no sign of them behind me. I was still nervous because I couldn't really see anything anyway, but I started to feel less worried as I approached the truck stop. I parked trying to check my mirrors to see if they were following me, but with the rain and lack of lighting, it was really hard to tell. The truck stop was mostly empty, apart from a few trucks at the gas pumps. I pulled over to the side and parked in the middle of the parking lot. After waiting a minute and organizing some of my things, I opened the door of the truck and poked my head out, looking along the side of the trailer. I was soaked by rain in a matter of seconds, but as far as I could see, there was no car behind me. I closed the door and finally felt a bit of relief, grabbing my pillow and blanket from the passenger side. I locked the doors, turned off the truck, and tried to sleep. Rain hitting the metal roof made it easier to fall asleep, blocking out any possible sound coming from other trucks coming in and out. When I woke up, I felt like I had only been asleep for a few minutes. I looked around and saw that it was still dark outside and the storm was the same, if not worse. But before I could check my mirrors, a loud bang shook the truck. I opened my eyes wider, reached for the door handle and opened it, looking back at the trailer through the rain. I could barely see the outline of a car with its lights off and 2 men moving in front of it. Terrified, I hesitated to get out and confront them, and as I sat in that moment of hesitation, the door suddenly slammed into my body, pushing me back even further into the driver's seat. Another man was outside yelling at me to stay where I was, then slammed the door shut again. His right hand was tucked into his sweatshirt, and with 2 other men behind the truck, he was in no position to try anything. I felt the truck shake as I just stayed in my place with the guy outside my door, watching my every move. He didn't even look away for a second. This continued for a few minutes, then they ran back to their car and drove off. He was still in shock watching his car disappear down the road. I called the police and made a report, but I never got any information about who the men were. All I know is that if I had been less alert and had simply tried to drive away in full view of the men, I probably wouldn't have been able to get out as safely as I did. The hidden house. He used to deliver Chinese food for a local restaurant when he was just a teenager in high school. Back then, any job I got wasn't going to last more than a year or two. I would say that this job was pretty typical for most early jobs or jobs in the retail and food service sector, as it had some slow and boring days and other busy and stressful days as a delivery driver. Although he was always grateful that he didn't have to work in the store and deal with crowds of customers, tonight I started at 6 p.m. It was Friday, so I was working a late shift from 6 to 12 hours. As soon as I clocked in, I was delivering orders non-stop for the next 2 hours with no time to breathe between them. By 8 o'clock, orders were dwindling a bit, but I still had a few more to deliver before I could grab my lunch. So I grabbed all 3 orders and set out to make them before 9 o'clock. The first was close, but the next 2 were farther away. This was not uncommon, as our city is not fully concentrated. I arrived at the second house, left it, and then headed to the last stop, which was 10 minutes from where I was. The label indicated that it had not yet been paid. During this journey, the only thing I could think about was the rest I would have after having been going back and forth for 3 hours straight, which had made me more tired than usual. That night, as I arrived in the neighborhood and followed the GPS directions, I realized that the whole atmosphere changed quickly. I turned onto a thin road of cracked pavement and potholes, with barely visible houses on the sides covered by thick bushes and unkempt lawns. When the GPS indicated that I had arrived, I stopped the car, but I didn't see any houses. I turned on the high beams and could barely see the outline of a small house quite far from the road I was on. Then I looked at the grass leading up to it and realized that there was actually a driveway, only it was wrapped in vines and tall grass. I would never have seen it if I hadn't seen the house first. Knowing that I wouldn't even be able to drive over it, I parked the car and got out with the bag, then started walking down the overgrown driveway. He couldn't believe how horrible it was to walk through there, and he couldn't imagine anyone allowing his driveway to reach that point. However, as I got closer, I could see more of the house. It was very small, like a mobile home, and seemed to be in a similar condition to the driveway, with vines growing over the windows and shrubs covering every inch of the nearly decaying house. As I approached the front door, I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my stomach and in my head. But I was just a guy with a first job who was afraid of losing it, so I felt like I had to do my job, which was to deliver the order to this address. I put away all my bad feelings and knocked on the door immediately. I heard footsteps approaching the door. It opened, revealing a young woman behind her. At first, in the dim light, she looked very normal, and I felt a great deal of relief. But it only took a few more seconds to realize that her normal appearance was eerily out of place with the condition of the house. There was no way she could be so well dressed and cared for while the house was in that condition. As these thoughts crowded into my head, she opened the screen door and said in an eerily calm tone, "Come in." Everything scared me at that moment. I took a few steps back and decided that I needed to leave immediately. I turned around, and just a second after I started to leave, I heard a bang coming from the side of the house. I looked over there and saw 2 men running from behind the house and running through the bushes towards me. I dropped everything and started running. I tried my best to get through the thick grass and vines, but just as I reached the end of the driveway, I tripped and fell to the ground, tripping over something. I hurried to my feet, listening to his footsteps approaching me. I couldn't even force myself to look back as I ran straight to my car, went in, and started it. The men stopped immediately and ran back the way they came. With my whole body still shaking with adrenaline, I turned around and left. Of course, I informed my boss what happened, and he urged me to call the police and report it. I was very relieved to know that he didn't care about the order but about my safety, which, looking back, would have been horrible if it had been otherwise. The police interviewed me and my boss and did a whole investigation, but in the end they couldn't find any of the people. However, the property he was on was owned by the state, and the no trespass sign at the beginning of the road had been torn off and thrown into the tall grass. Their intentions are unknown, but it seems that the most obvious possibility is probably the answer. I just hope that no one else has to go through what I went through, or if they do, I hope they can have the same luck as me to escape. The truck driver. I was returning from a friend's house who lives an hour away. We lost track of time, so I didn't leave until around 2 a.m. I was really tired and the trip was quite boring. Most of the way back was a long straight road that didn't seem to have any other cars for the first 20 minutes. It was just me staring at the endless pavement ahead and trying not to let my eyes close. But then, my headlights suddenly illuminated something on the road far away from me. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I got closer, I had to slow down and eventually stop. There was a large truck parked in the middle of the road, blocking both lanes. I stood there for a few seconds with no idea what I was seeing. At this point on the road, we were at least 30 minutes out of town, and there was nothing out there. The only reason anyone would stop here would be if there was an emergency. I looked to the right of the truck and there might have been enough room to get around the trailer, but there was a steep hill on the shoulder that would have been very risky to drive to the edge. On the other side of the truck, the trees were too close to each other to drive between them. After being there for a whole minute, I thought this had to be an emergency, and that my best and perhaps only option was to check what was going on. I got out of my car and started walking towards the front of the trailer. I remember how quiet I was outside, as if the night was completely still and empty. But when I got to the front, I noticed that the light was on in the driver's cab. I walked over to the door and knocked softly, then knocked asking if they were okay. The window was too high to see through, so I couldn't really see anything from the ground. After a few seconds, there was still no response. I called again, but there wasn't even a sound of movement inside. My gut told me that something wasn't right with this. I looked forward and then back, seeing nothing but fog in the distance, which only reminded me how far away I was from anyone else. I grabbed the side of the door and stood up on the steps, then looked inside the window. There were things scattered everywhere, almost like they'd crashed or something, and making the whole cabin a total mess, but there was no one inside. Then I noticed that the door on the other side was wide open. I backed up onto the road and started walking around the truck to investigate the open door, but stopped short when I saw a man in the woods coming up the side of the hill. He was tall, with shoulder-length hair, and had a very disheveled appearance. "Hey, buddy, are you okay?" The man didn't look at me, but he kept climbing up from the woods and onto the road. In the dim light coming from my headlights, I saw dark red spots everywhere on his clothes, and his face was covered in dirt and grime. Thinking that I was clearly not well, I offered to help, but he still didn't even recognize me. That was until I said I could call 911 for him. He immediately stopped walking and stared at me, maintaining eye contact for a few long seconds. "I'm fine," he said in a deep, threatening tone. I stopped talking and watched him get into the truck, then ran back to my car as the truck began to drive away. I turned around and drove straight back to my friend's house, where I called 911 and gave every detail I could remember. Unsurprisingly, the case never went beyond that. What happened on that road remains a mystery, one that still terrifies me. The way the truck was stopped on its side, with the cab as chaotic as it was, I think something or someone forced them to stop. What happened next is debatable, but the man I saw probably wasn't the original driver of the truck, and I think we can all assume what probably happened in the woods below the road. The truck delivery man. I'm a local truck driver for a common supermarket in our city, which means I stay within the same radius of about 80 kilometers and drive between the supermarket and various stores every day to deliver pallets of food. I don't have to make trips longer than 2 hours long, so every night I can return home at a reasonable hour and sleep in my own bed instead of at a truck stop, like most long-distance or regional truckers have to do. This day was pretty normal, going between a few stores and delivering the pallets, and I arrived at my last delivery location around 9. It took me half an hour to empty the trailer, but then I was ready to go back to the supermarket and rest through the night. Although this was always the longest distance, as the supermarket was on the edge of the city away from everything. An hour after I started driving, and about 15 minutes away, I stopped at a gas station to fill up the tank, as I had been driving with a nearly empty tank for too long. I went into the diesel section and started filling up the tank while leaning against the truck and waiting. I saw a group standing outside a van parked on the other side of the gas station. They were the only ones there, but they kept looking at me, watching me and my truck. It was strange, but I thought they were just waiting for me to leave, probably to do something stupid without witnesses. Once my truck was full, I put the pump back and got in, leaving the gas station. As I did so, the group also climbed into their truck and left, following me closely. Now it was definitely more than weird. I still didn't know exactly what they were planning to do, but they weren't even trying to hide it. For the next mile, as we drove away toward the edge of town, they kept zigzagging behind me, going from lane to lane and unable to maintain a steady speed. I took my phone out of the stand and called the police to report the group for reckless and possibly drunk driving. Being in a huge truck, it didn't make me feel unsafe, but I was more worried about anyone else who might be on the road. After a couple more minutes, they pulled into the lane next to mine and sped until they were right next to my window. I looked at them, seeing some guys looking at me and saying something to the others. Then they accelerated again and braked sharply right in front of me. I had no choice but to brake as well, stopping just before I crashed into them. As soon as I did, all the doors opened and 4 of them came running to both sides of my truck, trying to open the doors and get in. I immediately backed away, trying to put distance between us before getting it going again. My only options were to risk running off the road, which could cause my trailer to roll over, or ramming his truck. Obviously, I drove through his truck. The 4 of them ran off the road just before it hit him, and after 30 seconds, he was gone. By the time I arrived at the supermarket, police had already arrived on the scene, finding their truck on the side of the road and the 4 of them standing next to it. As the officer described it, they were all intoxicated but unwilling to cooperate in explaining what they were doing. Whatever they were trying to do, it was pretty scary to have 4 drunk, aggressive guys trying to get into my truck. Although it all happened very quickly and maybe doesn't seem that serious, I think if I hadn't acted so quickly, it could have easily escalated to something really horrible, but there's really no way to know what could have happened. The van. This happened to me during a road trip back from visiting family during the holidays. I don't usually drive more than a couple of hours because I prefer to fly, but this year the tickets to where I went were much more expensive for some reason. It would have cost me more than $1,000 to get a round-trip flight that only went to a few states. I had planned everything to get home a few days before I had to go back to work, but a snowstorm came on the day I was going to leave, so I had to stay 2 extra days before finally starting the trip. The roads were empty as the craziness of the holidays had passed, and most of the journey was quite far from the big cities. The hardest part was staying awake and fighting boredom. The first 8 hours passed smoothly, although I was tired, but the snow on the road kept me awake and attentive. It was about 10 p.m., and I had booked a hotel in a small town just 2 hours ahead, but as I was driving, a small light appeared in my mirror. It was someone's headlights behind me, which was the first person I saw on the road with me in over an hour. Its lights were rapidly approaching, showing that they were approaching very quickly, and I could soon see that it was actually a large van of some sort. It was a one-lane road, so I couldn't get out of their way, but I thought they would still detour around me since they were going so fast. However, once they got behind my car, they matched my speed and stayed behind me. After a few seconds, I realized they weren't trying to overtake me, and we drove like this for almost 10 minutes. It was a little unsettling that it was just us on the road, and yet this huge van was following close behind. It wasn't a normal following distance. They were so close that I couldn't even see their front bumper or the plate on my mirror. Maybe it was quick to feel uncomfortable about it, but an exit to a gas station popped up and I chose to leave, hoping they would continue down the road and I could put some distance between us. However, as I swerved down the exit ramp, they stayed right behind me. I went into the gas station and parked at one of the pumps while the van parked at the pump behind me. At this point, I just didn't know what was going on. Part of me thought this was a bad thing, but another part of me thought I was just overreacting. I knew this was the only gas station in the last 30 minutes, so it wasn't that unlikely that they needed gas too. I turned off my car and looked around the store. Part of the gas station had its lights off and a closed sign hanging from the door. I looked to the sides and saw nothing but empty darkness. No houses, no buildings, just a snow-covered field with only one road running through it. I looked in my mirror, and a man was outside the van pouring gas. I went outside and started doing the same, and as the gas meter numbers slowly moved forward, the man quickly put his pump back in and closed the gas cap. I looked and saw him walking to the back of his van. Then I heard the loud noise of the back door being opened. There was something at that moment, maybe a hunch or just an instinct, that told me to get out of there. I took the bomb out of my car, and not even a second later, 3 men were running toward me from the back of the van. I dropped the bomb on the floor and quickly got into my car, closing the doors just as one of them grabbed the handle and tried to open it. I was shaking and moving as fast as I could to start the car, and the 3 of them tried to open each door, but then immediately ran back to their van before I had a chance to drive away. When I did, I saw them soon walking away in the opposite direction along the road by which we had come. I informed the police of what happened, but I didn't even get a call back with updates. I think it's obvious that they were trying to kidnap people under the cover of night on the vast, uninhabited highway. What's scary is how confident and, so to speak, professionals they were throughout the operation. It seemed that as soon as they realized that I was safe in my car and that it wasn't going to be easy, they fled the scene without even needing to communicate with each other. It was as if they had done it many times before. What would have happened if I had been caught? I don't know, but I urge everyone to learn from my mistakes because they may not be as lucky as I am. The 3rd floor. In 2019, I was working delivering pizzas for a place near my school. I used to work most days after school so I could pay my car rental and rent. It wasn't a cool job in any respect, but it was enough to get me through college without running out of money completely. That night was no different from the others. I started work at 6 and was delivering pizzas for 3 hours straight, then took a dinner break and started again at 9:30. I picked up the next order and started heading to the place. The address didn't seem to be a house, but the route took me to a different place in town, away from most houses and shops, and towards a business center. It was an area full of small office buildings and nothing else. I drove down the street and couldn't really make out the directions, so I just followed the GPS directions and waited for it to take me to the right parking lot. When I turned, I went through a fairly long parking lot to the front of the building and could read the address, which matched the one on the order, but something wasn't right. The parking lot was completely empty. Not even the streetlights were on, and the office building showed no signs of anyone inside. I checked the steering again, thinking there must be a mistake, but everything was correct. I even tried Googling it to see if there were any nearby places with the same address, but there weren't any. This was the place. I parked my car and got out, looking around before approaching the door. It was a glass door with a dark tint covering it. I knocked and then stepped back, waiting. It was only a moment before the door opened. He was a middle-aged man dressed very casually and with a small smile on his face. Suddenly, he became too excited and said that he was happy that the food had finally arrived and that everyone was hungry. I looked behind him and saw no one else, just a light on in the middle of the hallway, but I ignored him and just told him the total. He must have realized what he was looking for, as he quickly explained that everyone else was in the rec room on the 3rd floor for a company party. I smiled to be polite, but the man spoke with an overwhelming amount of emotion, so much so that it almost seemed like he had to be pretending. He pulled out his wallet and handed me cash for the pizzas along with a $10 tip. But when I took the money, he asked me for a favor. He wanted help getting the pizzas to the 3rd floor. The man had put me in a strange position by accepting the generous tip. I felt it would be the right thing to do to help him. On the other hand, bringing a few pizzas isn't exactly difficult and didn't seem necessary in any way. He began to walk without waiting for my response, urging me to follow him as he made his way to a door that led to some stairs. I followed him, keeping my distance, not following him to the stairwell. However, when I entered, I felt a chill and noticed that all the lights were off. Only the small light in the hallway illuminated the entrance to the stairs. The man started to climb, but stopped when he realized that I had not continued to follow him. He turned and made a humorous comment about the lights, but his smile quickly disappeared when he saw that he was not following him anymore. He didn't hesitate to quickly approach me with anger in his eyes. I threw the pizzas on the floor, walked out the door, and ran into the hallway, then ran to the exit and headed to my car. I saw the man partially exit through the front doors before re-entering and slamming them shut. I immediately called the police after driving to another parking lot. By the time they arrived, the man had already left, and since he had paid in cash, there was no way of knowing who he really was. However, the office building was empty, and there was no one else on the 3rd floor, so it's clear that it was just some kind of trap. What awaited me on the 3rd floor is unknown, and I hope no one ever has to find out. Coops. I had some free time that night, and having had a few coffees earlier in the day, I figured I'd use that energy to go out and make some money. I was delivering orders for DoorDash, cruising down the highway to my next destination. It was very late, the roads were empty, and the night was very quiet, basically a delivery man's dream. On my way, however, my phone started vibrating. It was the customer calling me, but before I had a chance to answer, it hung up. Since it only rang for a couple of seconds, I thought it must have been an accident, but just in case, I dialed its number again. It rang for a while, but they didn't respond. I shook my head and forgot about it, not thinking about it anymore for the rest of the way. I left the highway and headed towards the neighborhood. It was a very common street with average houses. When I got to the house I was delivering for, I parked right in the driveway and started walking to their porch. As I put down the bag, I saw that the front door was ajar. I didn't know if it was for me or not, so I just gently knocked on the door and yelled that I was leaving his food. As soon as I did, I heard a somewhat disturbing sound coming from the hallway. It was a muffled bang that almost mimicked my knocking, as if someone was banging on a door. A little shaken, I opened the front door wider and knocked again. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just repeated that I was delivering his food. A few moments of silence passed. Then I heard a door open from the back of the house and a guy appeared around the corner. He looked distraught and upset, but he couldn't tell if it was because of me or something else. The guy walked down the hallway and walked over to the door I was at, without saying a word, as he began to reach for the bag. But that's when I heard those knocks again from the back of the hallway. I looked past him in confusion. as he turned and also looked, then quickly looked back at me, acknowledging that I had heard him too. "Is everything okay?" I asked carefully. The sound echoed back down the walls as the man simply stared at me as if he was trying to figure out what to do. "Why don't you bring the food inside for me?" he said, almost in a demanding tone. I nervously picked up the bag but quickly realized how terrible that idea was. I felt threatened, like I had to follow him, but I also had the feeling that if I did, I wouldn't get out of there. In my hesitation, the guy's face showed that he was even more upset, even angry. Then he reached out and grabbed the food directly from my hands, then closed the door in my face. Stunned, I stood there listening as his footsteps moved away down the hallway, and the beating stopped. There was nothing else I could do at the time, so I hurried off the porch and got back to my car. I finished my shift on DoorDash after that, and ended up reporting the really disturbing situation to the police. I think what led me to report it was that the man tried to get her into his house. If it weren't for that, maybe I wouldn't have felt that there was enough evidence to do anything. Unfortunately, the police informed me hours later that the man denied that anyone else was there and rejected his request to search his home. At that time, there was nothing left to speculate. I think something really horrible was happening, and that he was possibly ready to do the same to me, but I'll never know.